Hi friends, I'm Jeff E.G. About a year and a half ago, I decided to take my home studio up a notch by buying a Universal Audio Apollo audio interface. I gotta admit, I was a total noob when it came to using UAD plugins. Like a lot of beginners, I jumped in by buying an Apollo Twin X Duo because at the time, that was pretty good value. I also bought the Heritage Collection because it came with a lot of plugins and a lot of choices. Well, after about 6 months, I really liked it, but I found that I needed more. So I upgraded to an Apollo X4. A couple of the drivers were that you get 4 Unison inputs, and number 2, there's 2 headphone outputs that are independent. So you can have one mix for the person doing the recording and one mix for, say, a vocalist or a guest. So the process involved a lot of learning for me. Learning how to use console, learning how to use the plugins correctly, and techniques that I had really never used before with the other audio interfaces. Let me show you.
To say I was naive when I bought the Twin X is really an understatement. If you go to the website, they do lay out the details about what you're going to buy, but I wasn't aware that any of these devices came with plugins. Here I was on the Universal Audio website, checking out all these plugins and adding up the costs and going, okay, even on sale, and by the way, you're seeing Canadian prices here, I was like, okay, I'm going to need the Neve preamp collection. I need the Teletronics LA2A stuff. I didn't realize that a lot of this stuff comes bundled with any device that you buy. It's just something, nobody really tells you. So if you go to the website today and take a look at the Apollo Twin X, of course, they're having a sale. They're always having a sale. But the sale says here you get $1,145 worth of plugins for free, and that is absolutely true. But they don't go into detail to tell you what they are. So on this page, they do hint at what you're getting for free. And this sale, although it's extended to March 31st, 2023, there's always a sale where there's free plugins. And they have this picture of what's included. Have questions? Visit our facts page. They sort of tell you what the extras are. For example, if you buy any of these, the Apollo Twin X, Duo, Quad, you will get these plugins for free. The Helios Type 69 preamp, the V76 preamp, Fairchild, Teletronics, and the Oxide tape. And just to take a look at what happened when I bought it. This was the real-time analog classic bundle that was included with my Twin X. You can see it came with the Universal Audio 610A and B preamps, Ampeg SVT amp, the Marshall Plexi amp, and then there's all these precision things it came with, and some Pultec resources, mostly EQs, and the Teletronics LA2A Legacy, a distortion, and a reverb. But at the time that I bought it, I paid extra for the Heritage Collection, which added these 5, and that was more of the Teletronics LA2A compressors, pure plate reverb, some other things that were included. And they had a special sale on when I bought this is a while ago, that included the Antares Auto-Tune real-time, the P34 tape echo, Oxide tape recorder, Century Tube preamp, Helios 69, and LA3A. So all of a sudden, I go from thinking, I got to buy all of these plugins that I've heard everybody say great things about, suddenly got 14, 5 plus 6. I've all of a sudden got 25 plugins, and really, I don't know how to use them. Another thing, you get all the hype about the plugins and the Unison preamp. And really, if you take a look at the categories up here, in analyzing the available plugins, you want to focus on these Unison preamps because these are the things that really separate your Apollo interface from the rest because they emulate the plugin or channel strips and certain things, certain devices by taking advantage of the Unison preamps. Now the preamps work on their own, even without these. So you can just get your device, connect it, and it'll work and it'll sound great. But to really take advantage of those Unison preamps, you need to look at these channel strips. And you can see I bought one additional one. I bought the API Vision channel strip because so many friends who are studio engineers said, oh, you got to get this one. It'll sound really great. All the other ones that you can see here as owned on this list came with one of those bundles.
One of the features I was most impressed with was the fact that some of the plugins take advantage of the Unison preamps by emulating these classic channel strips and revising the circuitry inside the audio interface. The fact that it uses its own DSP and CPU to offload processing to the device didn't matter that much to me, but it really is the path to getting better sound quality. Now, some will argue that if you've got an M1 or an M2 Mac from Apple these days, there's plenty of horsepower in the CPU and you really don't need to offload. That's kind of true, but I still prefer to use the UAD plugins that take advantage of the DSP than the native versions.
Now, I had other audio interfaces that had mixing software, but nothing as robust as Console. So when you get any Apollo interface, you're going to have to learn how to use Console. And when you do, you'll be glad that you did, because it really is an excellent digital mixer. And this is instrumental to the no latency promise. Essentially, you're going to hear everything back through Console. You're not going to be using the software monitoring that's built into your DAW. And the interesting thing about the layout of the console is up at the top on each of your Unison preamps, and with me with the X4, I've got 4 of them. You can choose certain channel strips and inputs that are Unison enabled, that take advantage of the dynamic electronics and modeling that are built into those amps. So there's the API vision. Control everything from here, or you can use the desktop interface to adjust things like the gain and the output. When you take a look at what's available for the Unison, it's going to limit your choices to just those things that take advantage of the Unison preamp. So I've got these channel strips. There are no delays. And I have these 3 guitar or bass effects that also take advantage of the Unison preamps. And I can tell you that using that Ampeg SVT as a bass amp, it's the best bass amp emulation I've ever heard. And the Marshall Plexi Classic, same thing. Best guitar amp emulation I've heard. You just plug your guitar into the high-Z instrument input of the hardware and it sounds. So back to the channel strips. All of a sudden I go from nothing to, hey, how do all of these work?
Now, one of the other strategies at play for me was to get rid of an analog mixing board. I wanted to go completely digital. Once I learned the ins and outs of the UA Console app, I was really impressed. And now there's no going back. There's so much flexibility in the routing and the control, I can't really see working without Console.
When you first get your Apollo interface, you're going to download all of this stuff and you're going to make use of settings down here at the bottom. You're going to click on settings. There's going to be some basic setup for your hardware, like the sample rate, which is changeable, other parameters that define how your hardware is connected. Now, in my case, I have my old Mo2 8 Pre still in use, and it's connected to the X4 via ADAT. So I see a lot more channels that show up on my I/O matrix than you would see. So you can see here, you've got the X4 inputs, and around the 5th one, it starts saying ADAT, ADAT 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then there's some virtual channels, and you've got an equally complex routing option for your outputs. But I want to draw your attention back to the plugins here, because Universal Audio does kind of a sneaky thing here, is that there is going to be some plugins that came with your device and other plugins that you bought. But in this list, it's going to show you everything. It's quite annoying because it looks like these other plugins are available to you, but they're not. So you have to basically go through here and turn on hide. If you don't click on hide, all of these plugins show up. And when you try to open one, it says, you don't own this. Do you want to try it in demo mode, or do you want to buy it now? So it's kind of a marketing ploy that they show you everything that they've got every time you go to insert a plugin here. I found that really annoying. So I went down this list and I hid everything that I don't own, and I only display the things that I own. If you use a DAW like Logic or Bitwig or Pro Tools, same problem. You go into your plugins and it shows you everything. You have to do some work with Plugin Manager in Logic to not display the things that you don't own. Well, with all those plugins, I went a little bit crazy at first. I thought, why not use them all? So I fired up the API Vision channel strip because everybody told me how good it was. And I started looking at that and trying to understand how it worked. Yeah, it looks just like a mixing console. It's got a compressor built in, a gate. It's got EQ. It's got a lot of subtle little things on these buttons. And you know what? It's complex. And what did I do? Well, I added to that the Teletronics LA2A because, you know, I'd heard so many good things about that. And I added so many plugins on the first channel that I was using. I was getting too much volume. I was just getting distortion and artifacts. And it turned out I didn't know anything about gain matching. So I had to watch some YouTube videos and understand that each one of these plugins potentially increases the output of the overall signal. And in order to manage that, you might have to lower the gain or control the output. So I kind of went overboard at first, and that was a big mistake. I would advise anyone who's new to this to not do what I do. I would start really simple. One of the ways you can do that is with pretty old and familiar channel strip. And that is the 610B. And I recommend the B because it's simple, doesn't have a lot of buttons, and it sounds really good. So up at the top, you can see it's highlighted in orange. You can control the gain, adjust that to the setting that makes the most sense, and you can control the level. See, I'm actually changing that with the big knob on my Apollo X4. And lastly, you can control the output. I want the smoothness and warmth that comes with a UA610. So I've got the level just a little bit past 12 o'clock there. And in order to compensate for the gain increase, I'm dialing back the output slightly. And then I added to that LA2A Silver. And I would recommend this compressor. In fact, this setup that you see right here with just the channel strip and the compressor is going to make any of your recordings sound really good. And the reason I like the LA2A Silver is there really isn't much to control here other than these two knobs. How much gain and how much compression. You don't want to over compress your recordings, especially when you're just getting started with this. And then if you want to get fancy, pull in an EQ. And I decided I would use this Pultec after watching some videos and what settings I thought might suit the microphones that I have. You're really just using this EQ as a way to adjust the characteristics of the microphone that you happen to be using. In my case, I'm using a Rode NT1, and it's known to have some brightness that can be difficult to tame. Another thing to consider was this oxide tape, and it is really good sounding. It adds a little bit more to the warmth and smoothness, especially if you're recording vocals. You can see the output I have actually dialed back a little bit because I want the sound of the tape saturation to add its classic warmth, but I don't want to overdrive the signal to the point where it's too hot in my DAW. A thing I'm still on the fence about is I've added the Antares Auto Tune, and I have a theory here, and I'm not so sure my theory is a good one, but since I'm using these plugins on the way into my DAW and printing them, I wondered, does it make any sense to record notes from a vocalist that are not perfectly in tune? The common wisdom here is that any kind of pitch correction you want to do in your DAW, not in console on the way in. As good as the auto-tune is, it does add some artifacts. So one option is to not include it in the chain, not record it and print it to your DAW, and then just use it in your audio track inside Logic or whatever you happen to use. That way you can hear your audio track with or without auto-tune. Now, all the other effects like reverb, delay, time-based effects like that, and other adjustments, I do that all inside Logic in my case. But there is the option for you to hear those things when you're recording a vocalist or any part, and you do that here. So there's an auxiliary 1 and 2, and you can see they're set up over here, and you're basically routing signal. So I add a little reverb, and it'll go over to this plugin, which is the Pure Plate Reverb. An excellent reverb. On top of that, I've got a delay. I've got the Galaxy tape delay set up, so you're kind of getting the whole picture here. You'll hear it here. I can up the delay, or I can take it right down. Now, the thing about these effects is that You can hear them through your real-time monitor, but they don't get printed to your DAW unless you want them to. I've got them set up as post effects for monitoring purposes, but I don't have them printed to the DAW. As you can see, you go from something very basic of just using one channel strip to all of a sudden 8 or 9 plugins in your overall setup. Now, another important item about console is, and you'll find this in any video that you watch, is this button over here where you can have the preset effects printed or not. If it's set up for this button is on UAD record, then everything in these inserts, all the plugins that you've put in these inserts will get printed to your DAW. And that is what I want. The opposite is just having it as a monitor. If you have this on UAD monitor, what happens is the signal still goes through the Unison preamps. You can't turn that off. Everything goes through the hardware, through the Unison preamps, and makes use of the channel strips or anything that you have set up here. If you have nothing set up there, it still goes through the Unison preamps, but you're not getting any of the modeling of one of the classic channel strips from SSL, API, or Neve. But everything in the inserts here can be turned off or on. My whole goal here is to start with a limited amount of compression, some EQ that compensates for my microphone, and something to warm up the sound like the Oxide Tape plugin. And then, as I mentioned, kind of a debate about whether auto-tune should be at the front end of this or not. Everything else I do inside the DAW.
In a way, I'm kind of late to the game. People have been using Apollo interfaces for years, and it took me a long time before I decided I'm going to make that investment and I'm going to learn how to use it.
Okay, a couple of other things I had to learn the hard way. One was how to manage the headphone mix. Was so confused about this when I first started, I must admit. But there's a button over here called Q Out. On the X4, there are 2 headphone jacks that work independently. Headphone 1, HP1, and HP2. And they're set up for Q1 and Q2. You can output up to 4 Qs to different output options. You could have them go to a separate set of speakers or to a headphone amp, perhaps if you're recording a band. They work in tandem with what you see here on the sends. So in this example, we've already discussed that auxiliary 1 and auxiliary 2, auxiliary 1 goes to reverb, auxiliary 2 goes to the delay, but then you've got Q mixes 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this is where you can control how much of each signal goes to the Q mix. That's really handy. I mean, it's just like having an analog mixing desk, but you have it all digitally. I mentioned earlier that I have an old Motu 8 Pre, and it was a Firewire 8 Pre that was pretty much worthless because nobody wants Firewire anymore. And I mean, you can pick these things up for like $100 or $150, but it does have ADAT. If you set that up by plugging it into your Apollo Twin or an X4, you get 8 more channels, and you can see them down here. So aside from the first 4, which I'm using for microphones, and it's my preference to always use the Unison preamps for recording anything acoustically, vocals, acoustic guitar, any acoustic instrument, microphones in front of a guitar amp. I do that all through the Unison preamps because that gives me the best flexibility and the best option to use the quality of UAD's plugins. But then I'm into the ADAT channels that go through my Motu. And the Motu is not bad, don't get me wrong. It's just old and a little bit outdated. It's very good for things like keyboards and other devices that are plugged in directly, not going through a microphone. So I've got Motu 1 and 2, and then I've got something here called Other Keys. I've got an old Roland U20 and an XP30. And what you're seeing here looks like a single channel, but in fact, it's 2 channels linked together. So you look here, ADAT 7 and 8 are linked, and I labeled it XP30. And that's because I have that keyboard plugged into the 7 and 8 inputs. If I undo the link, you'll see it goes back to ADAT 7 and ADAT 8 if I wanted to use those as mono channels. But linked, they combine into one fader, which makes it easier to manage. The other thing I have that's kind of unique going on here is the system audio from my MacBook is being routed through console. And you can do this through virtual channels, but it's easy to set up, and it's a real benefit because you can now control the volume of any system audio source. So, sound effects that come from your computer, if you want to record those, just as I'm doing right now, they come through system audio. So I'll show you how that works. I've opened Finder, and I'm just looking for a song that I can play for you. And what's happening is you're hearing that song, and you can see in console, it's coming back through console, and I can control the volume of that system audio. And similarly, on this channel, I've assigned other virtual channels, virtual 3 and 4, to my DAW. When I'm using Logic, the Logic playback is coming through console. And this is great because if I'm doing some kind of recording where I've got Logic, system audio, and a microphone, like I might do to make a video, I can manage the volumes of all of these things. So in total, I've got the 4 Unison preamps built into the X4, and I've got another 8 inputs that come through the Motu for a total of 12 inputs. Reasons why you might use that in your studio: I use it primarily for keyboards because it's convenient. I can leave those keyboards plugged in, and I don't have to do a lot of wiring, and it isn't expensive to just keep that Motu 8 pre. The other reason I have it is if you record acoustic drums and you need obviously more than 4 microphones, I've got 12 to work with. And I would use the Motu in that case and its preamps to record drums.
If this video is interesting to you, click on the like button, add a comment, and let me know what you're thinking. And if you're so inclined, click on subscribe. Help me keep the channel going. Thanks for watching.